Let's come back to our discussion now. The Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng, it's his last day today. The President wishing him well in his retirement. I've got Dan Mafora, who is a research officer at KSEC. I've got Chris Oxtoby, who's a senior researcher for Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at UCT, and we're reflecting on the legacy of the Chief Justice. Chris, there's no doubt that the Chief Justice has spoken out fearlessly in defense of the judiciary's independence, but his role as the head of the country's judiciary, as we've all come to know, has been without controversy, mostly for the comments that he's made, be it on Israel or vaccines or speaking out against corruption in government. To what extent does this affect the integrity of the judiciary?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, he certainly stands out from previous Chief Justices who I don't think one could have imagined his predecessors being as publicly outspoken as he has been. And I think the real question is exactly that. What impact does it have on the credibility of the judiciary? I think, one might make an argument that Mogoeng Mogoeng was the Chief Justice that we needed at the time, that perhaps given some of the pressure that the judiciary was under, that we've alluded to, that having a more outspoken Chief Justice who was prepared to take a more more publicly outspoken stance was in some cases good for the judiciary at the time. I do think in certain instances, you mentioned the comments on the vaccine, the comment on Israel, I think that he went some way beyond where a Chief Justice should. And I think it's those kind of remarks that do run the risk of drawing the judiciary into issues that they should not be drawn into, in my view, and that does run the risk of people perceiving the judiciary as a political actor or as as being involved in things that perhaps they should not.
Yeah. Dan, how are you reading it? Do you think people responded the way that they did in criticizing the Chief Justice, even for the comments? Because they're not used to a Chief Justice that is so outspoken, that is not just docile, but that actually has views and expresses them passionately. Because the reality is these roles do evolve, right? The role of the Chief Justice and what the responsibilities are and what whoever holds that office does, that's going to change over time.
I think you're completely right. I think that, of course, at the time that Chief Justice Mogoeng became Chief Justice, the role had just been expanded to being the head of the judiciary and not just the head of the Constitutional Court. And so with that came responsibilities that are a bit more public-facing, that required him to speak to or engage with the public and broader community in ways that previous Chief Justices were not able to. I think what the controversies around his statements raise is an interesting question about, what kind of activities can judges get involved in outside of their judicial role, and to what extent can they, give their opinions, give their views on issues that are topical, given the risk that they might one day come before court. And so there is that tension between the limits placed on judges' abilities to express themselves, especially in public, but also on the need for the judiciary to be almost an indifferent player in the constitutional system or in the democratic system, simply because of the nature of the work of judges and it being, less out there in the public and more inward, more internally facing.
So what are the limitations then, Chris, so that you don't overstep the mark as the head of the judiciary? Because the problem here is the constant blurring of the lines between his fundamental right to express and practice his religion, express his political views, and his official responsibilities. So that balancing act is going to be crucial.
It is, and I mean, I think it is important to bear in mind that yes, any Chief Justice, any judge does have rights to hold views, religious or otherwise, has rights of freedom of expression. But of course, under our system, no rights are completely unlimited. And I do think that there are limitations that apply particularly when someone holds judicial office because of the responsibilities and the role that go with that, which Dan's alluded to, that the judiciary needs to both play the role of an impartial umpire deciding disputes, and it must be seen to be impartial. So the difficulty with judges expressing themselves too freely outside of the courtroom is that they can be perceived as no longer impartial actors, but as potentially prejudging and taking sides on controversial questions. That's, I think, what one has to be very careful to avoid, and what I think, with great respect, the outgoing Chief Justice has at times gone too far over that line on certain issues with some of his public statements. But I think it is as you raised at the start of the show, it is something that does change over time. Previous Chief Justices did not operate in a world of social media being the platform for allegations of corruption against the judiciary, for example. So I think I think those changing circumstances do require a more visible public role, perhaps from the head of the judiciary, than was the case before. But I think one also has to be quite cautious in how that's done. And I think this is something, when the new Chief Justice is appointed, that's going to be something that should be thought about quite carefully as to what qualities we're looking for in that respect.